Last month, I gave a talk which was a part of a series of research seminars within the Department of Religion and Theology at the University of Bristol. I have decided to make this talk publicly available via my YouTube channel, and am therefore going to give it again here. Intrinsic worth in the Phenomenology of love. Introduction. It has been said that love is blind. In this seminar, I will be arguing on the contrary, that through love we see. This is to underline the essentially intuitive or contemplative dimension of love. The basic structure of this talk is in three parts: a discussion of the Platonic account of eros, in particular the distinction between penia and poros introduced in the symposium, a discussion of Scheele's Phenomenology of love, and a discussion of the implications of this Platonic account and Scheele's account for the position of naturalism. Poros and penia in Plato's Symposium. Conceptualizing love, contemplation, and consummation. In relating to Socrates' myth regarding the origins of the divinity Eros in Plato's Symposium, the priestess Diotima suggests that he, Eros, is never rich nor at a loss, being the offspring of penia, or poverty and lack, and poros, or plenty and abundance. She explains that because of his mother's nature, he dwells ever with want, but on the other hand, by favour of his father, he ever plots for good and beautiful things. This basic tension between want and plenty has shaped much subsequent thought on love since the time of Plato. Plotinus, writing on love in the Third Ennead, says the following: Plato does not treat of it, love, as simply a state observed in souls. He also makes it a spirit being, so that we read of the birth of Eros under definite circumstances and by a certain parentage. Now everyone recognizes that the emotional state for which we make this love responsible rises in souls aspiring to be knit in the closest union with some beautiful object, and that this aspiration takes two forms: that of the good, whose devotion is for beauty itself, and that other which seeks its consummation in some vile act. This passage from Plotinus is significant. Here Plotinus, following Plato, articulates a major distinction in the philosophy of love, that is, between what I will term the consummatory form of love and the contemplative form of love, these being analogous to the penia aspect and the poros aspect of love. In a recent work on the topic, Vasilakis has put it thus: to the extent that the soul has a desire for the good, this represents its poros aspect, yet insofar as it desires, it falls short of the good, this is its penia aspect. On Vasilakis's reading, Eros essentially characterizes soul in Plotinus, inasmuch as the latter is an erotic entity which always strives towards its source. Since it desires, that's its penia aspect, the intelligible, that's its poros aspect. A similar distinction is deployed by the theologian and philosopher Rafe Cudworth, wherein he speaks of an Orphic Pythagorean love of redundancy and overflowing fullness, and a love of desire, which David Leach sees as corresponding to agape and eros, respectively. On the one hand, Cudworth's Orphic Pythagorean love refers both to A, God's eternal, self-originated intellectual love, which dispenses itself unindividuously, a love of infinite activity, which is both God's very nature and also the ordering principle of the created universe, and B, the superior motivational instinct in humans, which is the participated likeness of A, and both the highest perfection of human beings, as well as the source of morality. On the other hand, Cudworth's love of desire is seen as C, narrow and contracted selfishness, or the lower motivational instinct, which is not intrinsically bad, but needs to be kept in check. Penia, fumbling in the dark. A straightforward way of understanding the Penia aspect of desire is through the example of hunger. Penia, as presented in the symposium, is the personification of poverty, and as such is associated with lack, want, deficiency, and need. Hunger pangs exemplify a kind of physiological lack, that is, a lack of food. Hunger, a desire for food, is an instinct we share with animals. The lack of some vital resource, food, awakens a powerful urge to eat. This desire for food, rooted as it is in lack, is quickly annihilated once satisfied. Once we eat a sufficient amount of food, the desire dies away. Thus, in this sense, hunger has a finite end. The terminus of hunger is food. We might consider also that there is a certain blindness to this kind of desire, inasmuch as it is essentially unconcerned with how it is satisfied, but only that it is satisfied, in some way or another. Hunger, per se, is not a desire for pizza or cheesecake or whatever. Hunger is a desire to eat something, inasmuch as this something is food. In this sense, there is something purely quantitative in the orientation of hunger. The desire is not only blind to qualitative distinctions, i.e. what food, but might even be explained in strictly mathematical terms. To be hungry is to lack food, and to lack food is, physiologically speaking, to lack energy, calories. In the terms of biology, this has to do with homeostasis, the innate mechanism by which energy balance is maintained in the body. This kind of desire essentially relates all it encounters to an underlying lack. If hunger could speak, we might imagine it asking, can I eat it? Of everything and anything it comes across. The whole world becomes an opportunity to satisfy the desire, or else an obstacle to it. Desire, thus understood, instrumentalizes by construing all in terms of its capacity to alleviate some lack. All is seen in terms of its use towards some given end. There is a certain self-referentiality to this. Everything is finally related to the root lack. There is no moving beyond the horizon of this lack, so to speak. This characterization may seem somewhat exaggerated, though I think it captures something essential about desire, at least in its aforementioned Penia aspect. In reality, a multitude of desires can confront us at once. This is to say that we can be hungry and want pizza. What we are reflecting on here is a specifically consumatory kind of desire, which aims at some finite end, is annihilated by its satisfaction, is blind to quality, and relates all things to the basic lack in which it originates. To expand on the case of hunger, this Penia aspect of desire, or alternatively, this finite desire, might be more broadly seen as fundamentally associated with the vital or biological sphere. In other words, it is associated with survival and reproduction. On this view, eros would include not only hunger, but also sexual desire. It may also embrace aggression, anything related to the basic program of survival of the biological organism, such as, for instance, the Freudian conception of eros. There is at the base of this a certain egocentricity, hunger, libido, aggression. These are tendrils of desire sprouting out from the finite self or ego. I'll add a little note there that in some sense we're talking about the Freudian id here. Freud famously had a tripartite account of the psyche, the id, the ego, and the superego. But the id was this, he used the analogy of the iceberg. But if the ego is the tip of the iceberg above the surface of the sea, the deep structure of the iceberg, the majority of the iceberg, is actually hidden from view under the surface. And this he associated with the id, which was the locale of sexual desire and aggressive desire. Venus and Mars, perhaps. But that's perhaps a technical psychological point there. Anyway, so whether it is nutrition, intimacy, or security which is felt to be lacking, in each case the desire serves the root need with a myopic focus blind to all else. Though this sketch amounts to a merely animal conception of desire, inasmuch as it relates essentially to basic survival needs, there is yet in it a reaching towards some good as yet undefined. This Penia aspect of desire is like a fumbling in the dark for a light switch. There is in it a basic intentional orientation towards that which would ultimately illuminate, inform, and guide its movements, though absent the light, it can only ever amount to a blind fumbling. What I have hoped to underline here is the essentially consumatory character of this Penia aspect of desire, considered in itself. This kind of desire aims to assimilate all to itself. The basic experience of lack forms the fundamental gravitational center. With all this said, now we can turn to the poros aspect of desire, which by contrast is essentially contemplative. Poros, the good. Let's remind ourselves of how Vasilakis characterizes this poros aspect of desire. He writes, to the extent that the soul has a desire for the good, this represents its poros aspect. We might say that the poros aspect has a more objective character, inasmuch as it is essentially concerned with an absolute value, the good. This is to say, not the relative goods of food, sex, or security, but the good as such. This notion of the good is central to Platonism. We find it throughout the dialogues, and it is indispensable to an understanding of the poros aspect of desire we are pursuing here. Thus, let's consider more fully what is meant by the good by turning to the Republic. Here Plato supplies us with the analogy of the sun via a discussion between Glaucon and Socrates. Neither sight itself, nor that in which it arises, which we call the eye, is the sun. No, of course not. But I fancy that of all the organs of the sense, it is most like the sun. Very much so. And does it not possess the power which it has by the sun's dispensation, as an effluence from it? Certainly. Then the sun is not sight, is it? But being the cause of sight, it is seen by the same. That is so. Then you may say, I said, that this is my statement concerning the offspring of the good. That which the good has produced analogous to itself, which in the visible world bears the same relation to sight and what is seen, as in the intelligible the good bears to mind and what is thought. How so, he said, explain to me still further. You know, I said, that when a man turns his eyes not to those objects on whose colour the light of day is shining, but to those where the lights of night shine, his eyes grow dim and appear almost blind, as though pure sight were not in them. Yes, certainly, he said. But when they look at objects on which the sun is shining, I fancy that these same eyes see distinctly, and it becomes manifest that sight is in them. Surely. Now consider the soul in this same manner. When it is stayed upon that on which truth and being are shining, it understands and knows, and is seen to have reason. But when it is stayed on that which is mingled with darkness, that which is coming into being and passing away, then it believes and grows confused as its beliefs waver up and down and has the appearance of being without reason. Yes, it has. This then, which imparts truth to the things that are known and the power of knowing to the knower, you may affirm to be the form of the good. It is the cause of knowledge and truth, and you may conceive it as being known. But while knowledge and truth are both beautiful, you will be right in thinking it other and fairer than these. And as in the other world, it is right to think light and sight sun-like, but not right to think them the sun. So here it is right to think both knowledge and truth like the good, but not right to think either of them the good. The state or nature of the good must be honoured still more highly. Here the good is likened to the sun. The thought is that just as the light of the sun is illuminating some object, the thought is that just as the light of sun in illuminating some object makes clear our power to see, likewise does the light of the good in rendering something intelligible make clear our power to know. With all this said, in Platonic terms, the poros aspect of desire concerns the constant relation of the soul to the good. It must be stressed that this is not to identify the poros aspect of desire with the good, since the good is transcendent. Indeed, Vasilakis makes the point that even poros is always penia in relation to the good, and this because, for Plotinus, every level of reality is said to be penia in relation to its superior. Everything is always wanting in relation to its higher principle. But the point is that what is potentially good in intelligible matter, intellect tries to actualize, although it ends up with the best possible image of the good, which is the forms. The purposes of this talk, we will bracket the question of the broader Neoplatonic metaphysics with which Vasilakis is concerned, which arises from the mention of such notions as intellect and forms, though it will perhaps suffice to say that we are being presented here with a three-part scheme, typical of Neoplatonism, wherein is contained in ascending order soul, eros in its penia aspect, intellect, eros in its poros aspect, and the good, a principle of ultimate transcendence. With all this in mind, let's now turn to Scheler's Phenomenology of Love. The Eye of Love in Scheler. In accounting for love, Scheler wants to disabuse us of certain common notions regarding its nature. One such notion is that love is a feeling or an impulse. For instance, for Scheler, it would be a mistake to trace the origin of love to a complex of feelings and impulses. On Scheler's view, the acts of love and hate remain wholly independent of changes in the state of feeling, as is shown by the fact that throughout such changes, they remain fixed upon their objects, as with a steady and unwavering light. This is to say that love and hate are essentially unaltered by the vicissitudes of joy and sorrow. Thus, Scheler staunchly opposes Spinoza's definition of love as a kind of joy accompanying an external cause. This position on love might well surprise us, given the seeming close association between love and joy as commonly understood. For instance, the recognition of romantic love between two people is traditionally met with celebration, for example, with weddings, and not lament. Yet there is good reason for Scheler enjoining us to disentangle love from mere states of feeling. To equate love with a particular feeling of joy is to fail to appreciate the broader, universal implications of love. Love is, in this sense, the thematic whole which harmonizes the cacophony of feelings and impulses commonly associated and often conflated with it. Scheler gives as an example the case of unrequited love. It is precisely the steady and unwavering light of love which makes it so bittersweet. Scheler sees the pursuance of the act of love as itself the deepest of all sources of joy and sorrow, bliss and despair. Thus, for Scheler, love is essentially a fixed act and not a mutable feeling. So that's one aspect of Scheler's phenomenology of love, the fixity of love. Sacredness is the second aspect. Granted that love is essentially fixed in its orientation and not essentially subject to the vicissitudes of joy and sorrow, the question arises to what is love directed? Scheler suggests that it is never values we love, but always something that possesses value, and that while preference and rejection belong to the sphere of value apprehension, on the contrary, love and hatred cannot be reckoned as acts of apprehension at all. On Scheler's view, love is thus directed towards an end which is at once a precondition of value itself and beyond apprehension. This aspect I will call sacredness, and here my aim is to differentiate two salient features of its phenomenology: fundamentality and transcendence. Scheler thinks that love is oriented towards the possessor of value and not value per se, which is to say that something is valuable in as much as it participates in something which is more fundamental. Thus, a critical aspect of Scheler's phenomenology of love to highlight is that for him, love is fixed upon what is crucial to the disclosure of value. For Scheler, love concerns itself not with what is amenable to mere like or dislike, the gradations of value, but the very font of value itself. This is an essential dimension of what is meant here by the sacredness of love. Love is integrally bound up with something without which the entire horizon of value would collapse. where preference is concerned with the fruits of value, love is bound up with its root. Since it is not essentially contained in any particular value datum, the end of love is for Scheler beyond apprehension, which is to say transcendent. Scheler writes the inner spiritual vision of love should see something other in values, high or low, than that which the eye of reason can discern. For example, we might imagine here the relation between a parent and a child, wherein the latter returns with poor school marks. On Scheler's view, the eye of reason would discern the low marks and make a judgment accordingly, where the inner spiritual vision of love would see something other in these given values. For Scheler, then, a judgment which merely accounts for the values, high or low, is not essentially one of love, but of reason. We might note that there is a certain freedom which is offered in love's perception of something other in values. For the ever-present danger attendant upon gradations of value is that the particular good become conflated with the universal good. The intuition here is that to treat people strictly in accord with the gradations of value that they possess or do not is to obfuscate their essential value. Here, Scheler echoes Pascal's notion that the heart has its reasons, which reason knows not of. Movement is the third aspect of Scheler's phenomenology of love. We've had fixity and sacredness or transcendence. Finally, love for Scheler is a movement pointing from a lower value to a higher value. He writes, love does not simply gape approval, so to speak, at a value lying ready to hand for inspection. It does not reach out towards given objects merely on account of the positive values inherent in them and already given prior to the coming of love. For this idea still betrays that gaping at the idea of gaping at a mere empirical fact, which is so utterly uncongenial to love. Of course, there is an awareness in love of the positive value of the things loved, for instance, the beauty, the charm, the goodness of a person. But we can also be aware of this without any love at all. Love only occurs when, upon the values already acknowledged as real, there supervenes a movement, an intention towards potential values still higher than those already given and presented. These additional values are not yet manifested as positive qualities. Hence, for Scheler, love has a characteristically aspirational quality. It looks up, so to speak. True love opens our spiritual eyes to ever higher values in the object loved. It enables them to see and does not blind them. The blinding element is an empirical infatuation. This is never the love, but the central impulses which always accompany love and by which it is actually constricted and confined. This is something which we have already discussed concerning the Penia aspect of desire. Having covered the distinction between Penia, poverty, and poros, abundance, in Plato's account of Eros in the Symposium, and the three aspects of Scheler's phenomenology of love, fixity, transcendence, and movement, we now turn to the third section, where we attempt to bring all this together and bring it to bear on contemporary notions of naturalism. and see whether naturalism can really account for love in a meaningful way. So intrinsic value and the question of naturalism. To review, we have seen that in both the Platinian account of Eros and Scheler's Phenomenology, love is a kind of seeing. This essentially contemplative or intuitive sense of love is elucidated most clearly in contrast to the blind and consummatory model of desire outlined earlier. On this view, love is integrally related to, in Platonic terms, the good, a transcendent source of value from which particular values pour forth. In Book 2 of the Republic, Glaucon asks Socrates, how do you classify the things we call good? Do you think that there are some which we would gladly have, not for their consequences, but because we appreciate them for their own sake? This for their own sake, G.E. Moore develops in his notion of intrinsic value. In an essay on the topic, Moore gives the following definition. To say that a kind of value is intrinsic means merely that the question whether a thing possesses it and in what degree it possesses it depends solely on the intrinsic nature of the thing in question. Elsewhere, in his Principia Ethica, Moore writes that the subject matter of ethics, that is, the good, is a simple, indefinable, unanalyzable object of thought, which we intuit. This position is known in metaethics as ethical intuitionism. So, what has this all to do with love? Well, as we have seen on the Platonic view, love is essentially characterized by a relation to the good, where animal desire fumbles in the dark after particular goods and seeks to integrate them into the finite self. Love proper, love in the higher sense, sees, intuits, or contemplates the good as such in itself. This contemplative vision then educates or leads out blind animal desire into the light. Such is Plato's account of the ethical life, as given, say, in the chariot allegory in the Phaedrus. On this understanding, love is thus a wellspring of the ethical life, inasmuch as through its activity one comes into contact with the good. All this raises certain questions pertinent to the philosophy of religion. Central to the conception of love outlined in this talk is a notion of love as an activity of perception. One might reasonably ask, by what means do we perceive value? What is the organ by which a sight of the good is attained? In Neoplatonic tradition, this organ is identified with the nous, which translates from Greek into English variously as intellect or heart, this being a higher or distinctive faculty of the soul. This faculty is understood as essentially spiritual or immaterial, as an essentially spiritual or immaterial one, and is not to be confused with physical organs, such as the brain or the physical heart. My contention is that naturalism faces serious challenges in accounting for love thus construed, as is from a survey of contemporary literature in the philosophy, as is evident from a survey of contemporary literature in the philosophy of religion. For example, Susan Wolfe in her Meaning in Life and Why It Matters in 2011 writes, though I believe we have good reason to reject a radically subjective account of value, it is far from clear what a reasonably complete and defensible non-subjective account will look like. She writes this after dismissing the metaphysically mysterious conception of objective value, sometimes associated with Plato or G.E. Moore. Perhaps this is an unsurprising impasse for the naturalist to face, especially if they are, like John Dupree, committed to an anti-supernaturalism, which rids itself of immaterial minds or souls, vital forces, and divine beings. This is a problem for reductive naturalists, for whom, as John Cottingham puts it, ontologically speaking, there is nothing apart from the material world described by physics. But others, like Fiona Ellis, consider a scientific naturalism needlessly limited and instead advocate for an expansive sense of naturalism. Drawing on the work of Iris Murdoch, Ellis wants to argue for a naturalized Platonism. This would mean that she takes seriously the idea, quote, the idea that moral reality is there to be discovered, that goodness and virtue occupy a sovereign place in human life, and that we relate to this dimension of reality at the highest level, at the level of cognition. Continuing that such cognition has an irreducibly affective dimension, and further that it makes sense to describe it as a mode of loving desire. Though how this naturalized Platonism remains a form of naturalism is unclear, especially since Ellis wants to accommodate a notion of God in her naturalism. The difficulty for expansive naturalism lies in, as Ellis herself notes, how the relevant expansion is to be understood. This is to say, if we're not going to go with a scientific naturalism, a reductive naturalism, which, as Cottingham says, sees that ontologically speaking, there is nothing apart from the material world described as physics. If that's not the kind of naturalism we want to adopt, we still want to be naturalists in some sense, like Murdoch and Ellis. We get into a kind of expansive naturalism, but then the question sort of becomes, what is the kind of naturalism we're talking about now? What is our conception of nature, and how are we to understand the expansion of this term naturalism? So some concluding remarks. I've here advanced an essentially Platonic construal of love, which understands love as a seeing or contemplation of the good as such, in contradistinction to the consumatory character of animal desire. An exposition of this view was given first by an account of the Platonic view of Eros given in the Symposium, and later by Plotinus, and secondly by considering Scheler's Phenomenology of Love. Through this, we saw that love is integrally concerned with something other than the needs of the finite self, where by contrast, merely animal desire is fundamentally bound to those needs. Moreover, love is a kind of intuition of this something other, which is at once transcendent of any particular given value and the source of all particular given values. Seen as such, love is the wellspring of the ethical life. Further, we saw that the good at which love aims is characteristically intrinsic value. That is, it is good for its own sake, not for its consequences. Such is the case, for instance, of things which are true or beautiful, as opposed to simply edible, as in the case of hunger. We observed also that this view of love entails a certain organ of perception by which the good is discerned. This was seen to be, on the Neoplatonic view, the noetic or rational soul, the nous, being the organ by which it's perceived. Finally, I suggested that This view of this philosophy of love poses a challenge to naturalism. On the one hand, reductive accounts of naturalism have difficulty in accounting for value, while on the other hand, accounts of so-called expansive naturalism face the challenge of how this expansion is to be understood, and as such seem to accommodate traditionally theistic conceptions such as immaterial minds, souls, and even God. The crucial question here is, can Platonism be plausibly naturalized? Or does it necessitate a commitment to supernatural entities, such as, for instance, souls? My thesis is that the philosophy of love presented here necessitates theism, and the efforts to naturalize Platonism ultimately fail. Though this is a matter for further research, for now, these questions remain. Thank you for listening.